It's called sulfur shelf because it grows in a very shelf-like pattern, just like we can see here. It's also called sulfur shelf because of a yellow stain or a yellow coloration that it will have on the underside of the mushroom. This is a polypore species of mushrooms, and another interesting thing to note is there are some poisonous lookalikes, like the jack-o'-lantern is a really good example. However, the jack-o'-lantern is not a polypore mushroom. You may be asking yourself, what does polypore actually mean? Well, let's take a look at the underside of this mushroom, and we'll find out. If we look very closely at the underside of this mushroom, we're going to notice that it's yellow in color, which, like I said earlier, this is where it gets its name, sulfur shelf. The shelf-like pattern and the sulfur-like color of the underside of the mushroom. It is a polypore species, which means it has pores instead of gills. These pores are extremely closed right now. They're very tightly closed right now, which means that this mushroom is really fresh and it hasn't spored out. What that means as far as edibility is that this mushroom is in prime condition for eating. This is an awesome find, and this is a whole lot of chicken of the woods mushroom. If you look at the underside, you might notice what looks like little bitty pores or holes on the underside. That is what makes it a polypore mushroom. So this makes it very easy to differentiate between a chicken of the woods mushroom and a jack-o'-lantern mushroom, or a big laughing gem. There are a couple different species of sulfur shelf. Some of the ones that you might find earlier in the summer, like from June to July, are going to have a white underside instead of a yellow underside like this one in front of us. It's almost the very tail end of August, and this is a really good time of year to find the sulfur shelf mushroom, especially depending on the temperatures. It usually loves temperatures that get down to about 65 degrees in the middle of night, and all the way up to about 70 or 80 in the middle of the day. This mushroom will generally grow on hardwoods. I always find it on rotten oak logs or fallen oak logs, and I'm right past the edge of the oak forest on my property. So this tells me that this log it's growing on is probably an oak. Another thing that we're going to notice about the chicken of the woods mushroom is that on the edges, you're going to see these yellowish bands coming from the outside edge, radiating towards the inside edge of the mushroom. Now this gives us a really good example of how you've got this bright yellow edge, and then you're going to see these white striations following the edge of the mushroom. And it's going to have this sort of rippled appearance, as we can see here, this like fringe-like sort of appearance, how it waves up and down on the very edge of the mushroom, or on the very edge of the mushroom shelf. This mushroom is a very, very large producer. It generally can produce mushrooms weighing of up to 25 pounds. This is also a very extremely meaty mushroom. If we take a look at this one piece that was broken off, we can see just how big and thick this mushroom is. This mushroom is notorious for not shrinking whenever you cook it. It also develops its name, chicken of the woods, because of its taste and because of its flavor. Another reason it has that name is if we peel apart towards the inside, we're going to notice this very white meat that has these long streaks going down, these grains of mushroom flesh running down, that makes it look very similar to chicken breast. Now, another awesome thing about that is it also tastes just like chicken. It truly, truly does. This is an amazing find, and I'm extremely happy to find this. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be harvesting this one tonight, and I'm going to be cooking it up. Essentially, when it comes to cooking, you would cook it like you would any other mushroom. Just lightly saute it in butter for about 10 to 15 minutes, and you're generally going to be done. You can add this to pastas of all kinds. You can also add this to casserole dishes because of its very meaty flavor. In Europe, this mushroom is generally used as a replacement for chicken because of its flavor and its very hearty texture. This lovely little orange mushroom that we're looking at here is a chanterelle mushroom. These things are absolutely delicious, and they're choice mushrooms known all around the world for their amazing and unique flavor. So let's take a closer look at this. Now, whenever you're looking at your chanterelle mushrooms up close, and you look at the underside, one of the things you're going to notice is these gill-like structures. These aren't actually gills. These are what's called a false gill. So if you were to compare that to another gilled mushroom, you would notice actual ridges where the gills are, versus here, we can see these are basically just little indentations. And they run vertically, and they go to a decurrent fork towards the top, and they sort of disappear right here along this wavy margin of the cap. Whenever you look at the top of your chanterelle, one of the things you're going to notice is this kind of little indentation that we can see right here in the center. Kind of like a little well or a water well or a pocket, if you will. We're going to notice that the margin of the cap is nice and wavy, just like we can see here. Now, this is being so thin, as I just discovered, is actually kind of fragile. So be careful whenever you are picking these guys to not destroy them too much, because otherwise you'll ruin your harvest. Whenever we're looking down the cap, we're going to notice from the underside that it's kind of white, yellow, kind of whitish yellow here, and then it terminates into a more yellow color, and then it terminates more to an orange color here towards where it came out of the ground. Now the top of your cap of your chanterelle is going to be this nice bright orange color that we can see here. Now this is really nice because it makes them stick out really easy for the most part. They can blend in. Now let me show you guys how well these guys can actually hide. This here in front of us is one of the main types of environments that you're probably going to be finding your chanterelle mushrooms in. Here we can see all these nice little orange mushrooms. These are those chanterelles that we were just looking at. There's quite a few of them here. And now let's see how well they can hide. If you look back over here, right at the tip of my finger, is another chanterelle kind of hiding off into the distance. We can see those that we were just looking at kind of sticking out like a sore thumb. Then if we come back into this rose bush here, actually, we can see some more hiding underneath there. These nice, beautiful little treasures. Now, your chanterelle mushrooms usually like to associate with oak trees. So if you're in an area where there's a lot of old growth oaks and it's been really wet, hot, and humid in the middle of the summer, there's a good chance you might be able to find some chanterelle mushrooms. Right back over here, we can see another couple chanterelle mushrooms. And usually in July, after the very first rain in July, is when these guys are going to pop up. So they really love the heat and the humidity, and they definitely love moisture. Another thing you might notice in this area that I'm in, as you might notice, this area has been recently disturbed. There was a couple tree falls and a couple trees that were cut down in this area. And that's something that I've noticed with these chanterelle mushrooms, is that they kind of like areas that have been disturbed or right off of areas that have been disturbed. Now, as far as picking your chanterelle mushrooms, it honestly couldn't get any easier. And that's really all there is to picking the chanterelle mushrooms. Here you can already see in just about 2 or 3 minutes maybe, I've already got quite a bit here. Feels like I've probably got, I don't know, about a quarter to a half a pound, give or take. It's a pretty good sized amount of mushrooms already, and there's still a lot more to pick. As I'm sure you guys had noticed earlier, you can find quite a bit of chanterelles all growing in one patch. And these things grow kind of like a morel a little bit, as in they grow out of the soil and they grow in singular solitary clusters along the ground. Now there is a dangerous look-alike to the chanterelle mushrooms, so let's talk about that for a second.
The main distinguishing factor between the jack-o'-lantern mushroom and the chanterelle mushroom is that the chanterelle mushroom has false gills, like we can see here, and the jack-o'-lantern mushroom has actual true gills, like we can see here in the top right picture of the frame.
Right here you can actually see one of these chanterelle mushrooms. This guy is just a little bit too old to use. Some of it you might be able to use, but if we look deep inside of this, we can actually see this little slug inside of the center of this. We can see these little chunks that he's taken out here along the sides on the inside of this cap. So this guy is just a little bit too old. We can tell by how kind of white and dry it is right here on this top of the margin over here. Now here on this stump you can see all the nice chanterelle mushrooms that I have collected. And honestly, for actual time picking, this is probably maybe 10 or 15 minutes worth of picking in just a small little area. This is going to be enough for probably 2 or 3 people, even up to 4 depending on how you use it. These are not morels. These are what is known as the false morel. So let's take a close look at these and see what differentiates these from the true morel that we're after this time of year. As we get up close and personal with the false morel, the one thing that we're going to notice is its extremely ugly appearance. These things look almost brain-like instead of the morel, which looks a little bit more phallic in nature. Also, the morel, the true morel, will have pits Versus on the false morel, we can see all these waves and ridges instead of deep pits going alongside the top of the cap. Another way to determine a false morel from a true morel is that the false morels will oftentimes be growing on the ground like this. They do have a stalk, and sometimes they grow upwards on their stalk, sometimes quite as tall as a regular morel. But from a side view, oftentimes the false morel will appear as if it's just growing on the ground. But anyways, a false morel will oftentimes appear as if it's growing on the ground, though it does grow from a stalk. Let's take a quick look at the stalk of the false morel. As we can see, there's another false morel hiding underneath this little bitty log, and there are several more over there. So let's take one of these out and take a look at it a little bit more closely. After pulling that false morel out of the ground, we can see this small stalk that it has. Now over time, over the next week or so, this guy would grow up a lot taller and its stalk would be a lot more distinct and noticeable. Right here is a really good close-up. We can see the stalk goes inside of the cap of the mushroom, versus on a regular morel, the inside of the morel is hollow. Versus on the false morel, like we can see here on the inside, the stem actually goes all the way up through the cap of the mushroom. This is the best way to determine if we have a true morel or a false morel. The main reason you do not want to eat a false morel is because it is poisonous and it is toxic. Now there's obviously people out there who say they eat them with no issues, and that very well may be true. But the odds of that happening to you are slim, and it's best to not risk it. The reason we want to avoid a false morel in our collection bag is because they are poisonous. Simply cooking these and the steam it gives off can actually cause nasty side effects in people. Things like dizziness, nausea, vomiting, headaches, diarrhea, things of that sort. So we do not want to eat a false morel, and that's why it's important to know the difference between a true morel and a false morel.
You can see these little oyster mushrooms aren't that big. However, this is typical of oyster mushrooms this time of year. I don't usually notice them getting too big. Oyster mushroom is an extremely delicious mushroom to eat. It's commonly foraged in the early spring all the way to the fall. There are two different types of oysters. You've got summer oysters and you've got spring and fall oysters. This is one of the spring or fall oysters. A couple of ways you can tell that this is an oyster mushroom is its color. You can see how it's starting to brown towards the tip, and as this mushroom gets older, it's going to become browner and browner. Here you can see how the edge is scalloped. You can see how it hangs down. The gills of the oyster mushroom are forked and they are decurring. You can see here at the top how these are forked gills. You can also see how the gills go all the way down the stem. It's very important to keep in mind. Now the oyster mushroom is a shelf mushroom which prefers trees. Obviously, you see it growing on a dead log here. The types of trees that it prefers are generally, I usually find them on tulip poplars. As a matter of fact, I think, yeah, that's actually what this is right now. As a matter of fact, that's what this one is on right now, is a tulip poplar. But I generally find them on hardwood, softwoods, kind of like tulip poplar or maple, things like that. I don't usually find them on oaks or beeches or anything of that nature. However, you can find them on pine trees, although the way I understand it is those aren't so good to be eating. I don't know why, but I hear they make some people's stomach upset. I've never eaten them off of pine trees. I gather all of mine off of tulip poplars or the like.